Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to the Diamonstein Spielvogel Lecture Series, which provides a forum for distinguished artists to discuss the genesis and evolution of their work in their own words. Dr. Barbara Lee Diamonstein Spielvogel and Ambassador Karl Spielvogel generously endowed these series in 1997 to make such conversations available to the public. And I'd like to thank Ali Peel and her team for organizing the event. American artist Zoe Leonard is this year's speaker. Zoe, who was born in Liberty, New York in 1961, is acclaimed for the sculpture and photography she's made over the past 3 decades. While the subject matter in her photography ranges widely, it's informed by an incisive critical scrutiny of the conventions, protocols, and politics of image making and display. Her work has been featured in numerous solo and group shows, including a 2007 retrospective that toured in Europe, exhibitions at the Dear Art Foundation in 2010, and the Museum of Modern Art, New York, in 2015, Documenters 9 and 12, and the Whitney Biennials in 1993, 1997, and most recently, 2014, when she won the Buxbaum Award. Her show, Zoe Leonard's Survey, will open at the Whitney Museum of American Art in early March 2018, so very soon, and then travel to MoCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles. Today's lecture will take the form of a discussion between the two of us. Please join me in welcoming Zoe. So, in 1997, in the Whitney Biennial, you exhibited the Faye Richards Photo Archive, a work comprising, as we see, some 82 photographic prints together with notes and captions. And I thought we might begin talking about it, partly because it's here, and so people can see it, and partly because of the way it offers an entry into your practice, to thinking about issues and ways of working that have run through your work over the past several decades. So, how did it come about?
Well, first, I just really want to say hello. And thank you, Lynn, for... I'm so incredibly honored to be part of this show and to be here today. So thank you. I feel like there's going to be crying. Hopefully not, but happy tears. But it's just incredible to see to have one's work put in a context that's so wide-ranging and profoundly questioning of who we are and how we build societies and what it means to be American. I keep hearing people say, "Oh, it's amazing, it's extraordinary," and the show, and I feel like I haven't found the word yet that encompasses just how big it is. So it's been great to come and walk through the show. This piece, to bring it back to my work for a moment, this piece I made, I was requested to make it. The filmmaker Cheryl Denier, who was a young filmmaker at the time, had an idea for a film she wanted to make in which the protagonist gets interested in a character actor in a few Hollywood films and someone who's only credited with the Nomer Watermelon Woman, and she becomes interested in this character and she researches her, and it was going to be kind of like a faux documentary, but this person didn't exist. So Cheryl came to me and said, could you put together a body of photographs that would make this character believable, like make her seem historically as if she had lived? And first we were like, oh, can we scrabble together things from flea markets? But of course that wouldn't work. I kind of sat down with Cheryl and put together a timeline of Faye Richards' life, and then thought about the instances at which she could have been photographed. And then we figured out how, with absolutely no money and just a lot of friends and all their borrowed clothes and furniture and expertise, over the course of about a year, we sort of developed the storyline that would be these photographs, and then I shot them and worked with a few assistants, and actually the cast and crew list are part of the artwork, so within the artwork, it's evident that it's a fiction, and that it was made by that it was made collaboratively. So everyone who was part of it is sort of also part of the artwork. And after the shooting, I was going to head in the darkroom, and I was like, this is a lot of work. And I know that I have, as every photographer does, my own printing style. And I didn't want it to look like it was all shot by one person. So I asked a number of friends. I think we had a group of 7 or 8 people, including A.L. Steiner, Jack Louth, other people that people in the room know, and asked each person to sort of embody the character of one of the photographers. And so one person printed like all the glamour shots as if they were that photographer, and someone else was like the news photographer, and someone else was like the snapshot photographer. So we sort of distributed them, printed them all separately in editions, and then had these kind of parties where we handled them and left them out in the rain and spilled tea and coffee on them and wrinkled them and walked on them until so that they would resemble photographs that had actually been out in the world. So yeah, in a nutshell, that's it.
So there are many different types of photographers. You said film stills, publicity pictures, family snapshots, casual images, shot with and printed so they look differently.
Yeah.
You obviously have a very deep knowledge of photographic histories and traditions, technical processes and mediums, but you don't have a formal academic training. And I understand you left school early on, high school, but you started making art quickly. Mm-hmm. Do you think it's necessary for an artist working in photography to have this knowledge, to acquire these kinds of in-depth technical skills and to know the history of the medium? Not do they need to go to art school. You found other ways. You go to museums often. You had older friends who were photographers, I understand, and so on.
That's such a great question. I don't think anyone's ever asked me that before. It's a tough one because I think rendering an image on your phone or even on an analog camera is really easy. But making a good picture is something else entirely. And figuring out what you want your pictures to means that you have to figure out what you want them to look like. Like that's how you communicate meaning. It's not just the image material. Is it dark or light? Is it color or black and white? Is it soft or sharp? Does it have a lot of depth of field? Is it big? Is it small? Is it digital? Is it analog? So I think as in any other art form, you have to learn your medium. And whether that's through formal training or through accident or through trial and error, I think in order to develop your voice as an artist, that's what artists do. That's actually what art is. I read this really great, there was a section in this Linda Nochlin, this very well-known Linda Nochlin essay, Why Have There Been No Great Women Artists? It's a whole other conversation, but not unrelated to this one. But there's a section where she talks about a public misunderstanding of what art is. And I'm paraphrasing wildly and loosely right now, but that art is not an experience or a feeling or an idea. Mm-hmm. It's a practice where something is actually materially realized with a certain language that is developed and honed and made specific to what it is you want to say. And so photography, yeah, can anyone take a picture? Absolutely. But if it's a practice, you've got to get to know the range of it. And that's not about it being a traditionally high quality, fine art print. Mm-hmm. That doesn't mean it's a better photograph. It can be the rattiest, just shittiest, most blurriest, blown out, nastiest thing. If that's what you want to talk about, that's what the picture should look like. So, yeah.
And really from the beginning, when we look back to early work, it's often double dated. And it's dated with the year you took the image, and it could be 4 years later and it has a second date. Mm-hmm. And that's because over 4 years you thought about which paper, what size, mm-hmm. how dark the print, and so forth, mm-hmm. And maybe context. That's pretty unusual, Zoe.
Yeah, so I hear, yeah. Yeah, it can be, sometimes it can be a matter of months, sometimes it can be as long as 10 or 12 or 15 years. And a lot of that is figuring out the print. I think one could say, I've said this before, but that maybe your negative is your score mm-hmm. and the print is the performance. So you have the bones of what it is that you want to make or mm-hmm. say, but then the performance is something you really have to think about. Sometimes it's also that I don't. Sometimes you just don't know what to do with something, and you're like, I like these are interesting, but I really don't know what I'm trying to say with them, and they go back in the drawer, and they keep coming back out, and you're like, and some of them you just eventually are like, that's actually just terrible, and others keep coming back and asking you to resolve them, and at some very surprising later moment, you're like, oh yeah, remember that, and scrounge around in the drawer till you find those negatives. So perhaps there's a real affinity with writing, mm-hmm. where the generating material and then the kind of editing process and the honing process, there's a real relationship there to that kind of mm-hmm. the stages of work.
And you look at a lot of photography very widely.
Yeah, as much as I can.
And
yeah.
So some of what you're looking at is amateur photography, one could say. Some of it's made like topographical shots from airplanes, scientific photography mm-hmm. connected to astronomy. I mean, it's not just different techniques, they're mm-hmm. made for different purposes, and they usually have, the aesthetics are not foremost in the photographer's mind. Mm-hmm. Do you see those as somehow in a different category? Is it that photography is so broadly based in the culture and it serves so many different ends? What happens when work like that enters the art museum?
Okay, wow, that was a lot of different questions. Okay, so I think this sort of dovetails with something really, I think, important about the role that photography plays in this show. Mm-hmm. And the fact that photography has always been a kind of outlier mm-hmm. within the museum and within fine art. Photography came from like a bunch of, there's a naturally occurring phenomenon of the camera obscura, that this thing happens with light when there's a small aperture. But then a bunch of like kooky guys in the, 19th century who were like burning mercury in their basement and like dragging glass plates down canyons and, fixing the image. So it wasn't really, it never had, and I don't think it ever will have the status of painting, the kind of serious cultural high art value of painting. And that's what I love about it, actually. I don't mean to diss photography. I think it's a fundamentally different kind of practice. Photographs are used, they're vernacular, they're utilitarian, they're popular, now we've all got it in our pockets. It's a whole other kind of language that it hasn't ever been really sanctified within the museum. Although I think there's a certain amount of respect for it, I think it's always been a little bit of a shaky ground of like, where does it actually belong in the museum? And there've been, there was sort of an early turn of last century movement, the pictorialist movement, where the highest compliment was like, oh, that's so painterly, where the photographs were trying to sort of mimic a kind of painting. Whatever, if you want to go that route, why not just paint? Although there's some great, great work done in that field. And I've never been interested in that. I've always kind of been fascinated by the practitioners that wanted to really have the camera in the world doing what the camera does. And there's the whole kind of middle of last century, well, there's all the experimental European, and then the middle of last century where street photography came into its own and came into the museum. Friedlander, Frank, Lisette Modell, Arbus. But there's still always this argument of like, is this really art? And I think what's so great about our moment and some of the proposals in this show is that it's just, we can kind of skip over that whole argument and kind of look at it for what it is and what it does and love it on those terms and not try to make it into something that it isn't. Does that make any sense? Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
And do you think that's reflected in the fact that many contemporary artists who use photography either exclusively, like Cindy Sherman, or a great deal, as you do, but not exclusively, tend to self-identify as artists who use photography, and there are not, Thomas Struth, I would think, in many ways, there are not, the ones who call themselves photographers often tend to come out of that very refined modernist practice strand and moving forward, and that the point of the broader term artist is that the medium is in service to a vision of whatever that might be. Do you think that's just like all the problems or what I call term warfare that dominates this field? People deciding this is folk, no, this is outsider, this is isolate, where in the end they're historically determined and they shift constantly. But it's the frame that makes the meaning, the context in which the word occurs, and when it's coined or when it has currency.
Yeah, I think that's a really, that's super interesting. And in the parsing out of terms in your essay for this show is so clarifying. And I think the only way to present this work, there had to be a new term, because each and every one of those other terms, whether they were laudatory or whether they were dismissive, had baggage. And so this allows it a new frame that suits the proposal of the show, or the proposition. In photography, I'm not against being called a photographer. There was definitely a time in the 90s, early 90s, which is kind of when I really started showing seriously, so an artist who uses photography. And I think that was a way to, I began showing in art galleries that were not photography galleries. They're like dedicated photography galleries. And there's this sort of photo world. I know there are people here who know about that. Andrea Geyer, front and center here. And then there's this sort of large field of contemporary art and the galleries and the museums that are interested in that. So it communicated that your work could be shown in a different kind of context, and it allowed one's work to be considered on peer with other people that weren't working in photography. And I was always more comfortable in that kind of wider ranging and more promiscuous kind of pairing. And one thing I wanted to say about that, when you were saying, oh, I look at a lot of photography and lots of different kinds of photography, I also look at everything else. And I think this is another one of the amazing things about the number of different mediums that are in this show, but very much the way that artists live their lives. Often art historians or academics, or the sort of the process of art history, draws clean lineages for artists, like, oh, painters come from this painter and this painter and this painter, and then you're the heir to this, blah, blah, blah. And the fact is that artists' lives, for the most part, have a whole other kind of horizontal or oblique set of relationships and influences that are about, you know, going to poetry readings and watching television, and the range of influences is way outside your medium. But now I've lost the question I was answering before.
Yeah, I have two.
Okay, whatever.
Well,
It was about
categories.
terminology and category. Yeah. But I think, I'll take either. You know, I say I'm an artist usually because I work in a number of different medium, but when I work in photography, it's not something that I consider ancillary. When I'm like a full-on photographer, and I think it's my home, my artistic home. The sculptures that I make, the installations that I make, the other work that I do, I think is deeply committed to the ideas of photographic seeing and the terms of observation and recording and understanding and temporality and all the things that I learn and think about through photography. Those same principles those same principles are sort of, they travel around with me to these other medium.
And does that include writing? There's a text of yours that's out there that's getting a lot of attention now. I Want a President. But I'd also look at an essay you wrote a couple of years back for James Castle Show. Really wonderful catalogue essay. So they're two very different forms of expression. But the amount of time and effort and crafting that goes into them, seems to me it's comparable to making a work, whether or not you call it a work. Is that part of your, just the kind of highly responsible, committed way you approach what you do, like in the broader sense?
I think it's, I would love to consider myself responsible and committed. And I'll take that too, along with artist and photographer. But it started much more organically than that. As like a teenager, I was like one of those kids that knew I was an artist, but I wasn't sure if I was an artist or a writer. And I always had the notebook, and it was like in the coffee shop all night long, writing in the notebook, like moody and just writing in the notebook. And then there was the camera. So they're very different, but they're really good companions. The camera and the notebook are these two kind of small things you can carry with you and, record what's happening, record the world, but also sort of intercede or have a way to understand. Like the looking and feeling the world is such a big thing. We're all doing it all the time, and it's kind of overwhelming. And so processing that material, thinking about it, for me it was always writing about it, taking pictures of it were ways to look more closely or to give myself the space and time to think about what I'm seeing, what am I experiencing, taking a little note. It's about remembering it, but I think it's more than just about writing something down to remember it. It's actually in that moment you're helping yourself process. People do that in museums too. You're like, are you ever going to look at that scrap of paper again? Probably not. But in that moment, it's sort of giving you the space to, something was special about that, and I wanted to take note of it. So the writing and the photography sort of came up together. And there was definitely a moment when I was, in my precocious teens where I thought maybe I was a writer. And I'm definitely not. I mean, I'm friends with really good. I read a lot, like Eileen Miles, who's the person who ran for president the year that I wrote I Want a Dyke for President, she is a poet. And she thinks it's hilarious that I'm being referred to as a poet and that that's referred to as a poem. And it's great. I'll take that too. I'm like, yeah, I'm a poet. But, but I'm not like a poet, like a serious poet. They know they know poetry in a way that I don't. I read it, I love it. And I wouldn't call myself a writer. But writing is an important part of thinking and making for me, and it's something I do in the studio a lot. I also draw in the studio a lot. It's a way to start diagramming and thinking and parsing ideas out, and to do something active when you don't know what to do in the studio. And I know every artist here, right? You're in the studio, and you're like, oh my God, what am I doing here today? You're like, I've got to stay here for at least a few hours to make it look like I'm real. But you're like, oh, And so you do something. So sketch out the ideas, just start gathering material, count postcards. You could try it. It has all these different functions, and every once in a while there's a request or a charge to make a finished essay. And Castle is just one of those artists that the second I first saw his work, I was like, who is this person, and what are they doing, and what are they making? And it was really exciting to be asked to write for that catalog. But it's long, and to all the writers, oh my God, it's hard. People really work. Writing is so hard.
Maybe we can look at an image, and I want to look particularly at, you've used postcards in a number of works, but I'm particularly interested in this because this is a postcard rack at MASS MoCA, and here are some of the cards. And we talked at one point about including this in this show.
Yeah.
And, in the way that things evolve, it didn't happen. But can you say something about it, its genesis, and maybe how you think it might have fitted?
Okay, yeah. I made this piece. There are very few times when I've made a work specifically for a show. This is one of those times. I was invited to participate in a show called Yankee Remix. Anne Hamilton was also in that show and made an incredibly beautiful piece. It was at MASS MoCA. And MASS MoCA was doing a collaboration with a local historical society, the Society for the Preservation of New England Artifacts. It was like SPNEA is what I remember. Anyway, we were, perhaps a dozen artists, were invited to go through the really substantial holdings of this historic society. They owned a number of historical houses, including one modernist one, and the rest were sort of more colonial houses. Lorna Simpson was also in the show and made a knockout video, 2-channel video piece in using 2 of the historical houses. So we were all invited to respond to or use or somehow work with the holdings of this historical society. And they had there were the houses and the furniture in them, and you could work with that. And then they had this crazy, gigantic, freezing cold warehouse in, I think, Reading, Massachusetts. Is that where you could paw through like an enormous amount of inventoried Americana and make something? So I went through a bunch of different ideas, as one does, and then decided that I wanted to make this. It sort of started, I think, where I was sort of photographing objects I was interested in or attracted to, but it began to hone down more to things that the rack, I think there were 36 different postcards, and on the piece was called For Which It Stands. And I thought about how in their totality they could be some kind of composite set of notions about what it is to be American. I think it was the year we were going to the Iraq War. And so there were objects that were either like interesting or funny or tragic, but that seemed somehow loaded in a specific way. Some of them were just, kind of like the Scholl's sandals. They were like things I remembered from being a teenager. But there were a few items that I found in the collection that began to drive the work and that changed the work. One was the embroidery on the right was a embroidered fire screen. It's something you'd sort of put in front of the fire so it wasn't too hot. And it says "We's free," and there are two African-American or dark-skinned people dancing. And I was like, whoa, okay, this is changing the project. And then this painting of a child with those books where you learn the alphabet, and you can see in the close-up it says C is for cat and D is for darky. And I thought, okay, again, the project's taking a little bit of a different spin. And then I asked about flags, and they had this amazing flag, and there was a lot of kind of cowboys and Indians. So I photographed different things. I really love postcards. A lot. And I've always loved that really old-fashioned kind of museum postcard that's just like a color background and then like the object, like this is the Ming vase or this is the whatever. And some of those from the 50s and 60s, it's like, oh my God, the pinks and the greens, and they're just, or sometimes there's like a shelf, but they like put fabric over it, like so you can't see the shelf, even though you can see the shelf, but it's like that great, like this is my object. And it's very different than advertising. It's not like food styling. It's like, it's this very particular kind of presentation of an object that's supposed to be classy. It's like, this is museum worthy. So I was like, yeah, I want that. And I don't really know anything about lighting. I always use available light. So the Mass MoCA had a kind of in their workspaces upstairs, a kind of north window gallery. So we just set up a table, and Jocelyn Davis, who, I don't know, did Jocelyn make it down here? Oh, Jocelyn, who is like beloved, has worked with me for 20 years now. She was like the steaming, because she's like, she knows how to sew, and so it's like steaming the fabric. And so we had this whole crazy setup with like and then it was a museum, so it was like the puffy slippers and the gloves and like our trolley of objects, the objects we're pulling from the collection. And we had a blast, and we're like, ooh, okay, bring me that Burger King crown now, please. Like, oh yeah, put your gloves on. The way photography, again, can be moved from being, this is an artwork, but the use of photography is as documentation, and it's taking on a really specific style of photography that communicates something about the relative value of different kinds of objects. And by putting all these different kinds of objects on a horizontal plane in terms of their treatment, the piece asks the question about their relative value and what they mean cumulatively in the museum and what they mean dispersed in the world as individual items. There was also a thing where you could buy the postcards. There was like an honor box there, and you could just put in, I think it was 50 cents a card or something. And there was some math about like, once the things were sold, we could print them again. Of course, that never happened. But I was thinking about how then these images separated from their the other constituent parts and separated from the museum, what would this image mean when it like ended up on someone's refrigerator somewhere else? The way the postcards traveled through the world, or how they did then. I mean, it's not as much so now, but I don't know, ideas of kind of commerce and democracy, ideas of class and distribution, which I think are very much at play here. all the different kinds of objects, and what does it mean to wrestle them free from their category, and put them next to each other and reevaluate them for what they are and how they were made and what they look like. And their meaning shifts when you give them space.
It's interesting because the photograph with the neutral monochrome background and the object purports to be a documentation of the object, but given the way photographs like that, or postcards like that, are not current, that's the signifying system of the whole visual language that you've just described is what dominates. And what I find interesting, and how it opens up a discussion we were having yesterday, which goes back to an earlier discussion, and that's in the first gallery of the exhibition. There are 2 Charles Sheeler photographs of a house in Doyleston that he rented and photographed in 1917. So they're very early in Sheeler's career, and they're amongst the earlier works in the show. And they're the only photographs for the first 8 galleries or so. I mean, there's no photography until we get to Faye Richards. And we talked about the Sheeler a lot, and whether these 2 photographs would be anomalous and why start a conversation about photography when it's not going to be played through, or seemingly not being played through for a while. But in that room, there's also the Index of American Design, which is some 18,000 watercolor renderings, which were made as part of a New Deal project beginning in 1937. And as a New Deal project, it was partly generated to provide jobs for commercial artists and illustrators and other artists who were out of work as a consequence of the Depression. But it had multiple purposes. And one of the others was to make a kind of archive of representative but fine examples of decorative objects and applied arts objects and religious artifacts and so forth, nationwide. As it happened, the Index didn't set up offices in the South, and so there are very few objects from the South, but they're pretty widespread, and the watercolor renderings are made to very strict conventions in terms of representation, the size of the page, the angle at which a piece of furniture is represented, and so on. So the people working on the project were vetted, and then they were given strict instructions, and in fact, sometimes if the work was thought not to measure up, it was rejected. But the choice of watercolor for this vast project over photography, and you think this is 1937, watercolor was chosen because the organizers of the Index asked the advice of archaeologists and Egyptologists about watercolor versus photography, and they were advised that watercolor would be a better medium to use because it provided more information.
Yeah.
And that's so interesting.
Yeah.
And so we have the Sheeler photographs, which one might think, though probably not, that they document the building, because they don't. They're clearly something else, the poetic truth and the formal resolution. Take them into another kind of arenas, and that's obvious immediately. But weaving it back in relation to these postcards and your interest in postcards more broadly, as you've used them in other projects, the idea of truth and representation and how the vernacular plays into that. I know it's a huge question, but do you want to say something about some of it?
How much time do we have? I mean, it sounds so absurd to say that the watercolors would give you more information, but in a funny way, I can see that that's true. Like sometimes if you're going to build something, it's like drawing a diagram. Like there's something diagrammatic about the emphasis that you can give, the details that can sort of inform texture, or you're not bound by the specific lighting conditions that a photograph Right. As to the larger question, I mean, I think Sheeler is such an interesting figure in this show, partly because, he is recognized as a mainstream, fine American artist, but he had a hybrid practice and was working in photography as much as in painting. And I think you could argue that the photographs are every bit as important as the paintings. And then in the paintings, there's this, this abundance of folk art objects and shaker objects and textiles. And so there's also a kind of inventorying that's happening in these paintings too. And we were having a sort of broad conversation with a group of friends, and sort of these ideas of like a clean or perfect modernism, or the myth of the kind of clean and perfect modernism versus one that is more complex and still has to do with the uses of the hand, and that's not all about machine production and industry, but that Sheeler would stand alongside Strand and a number of other modernist photographers as kind of paramounts in, but there's this all this other kind of material because of the way that he's switching back and forth, and because of the way that he so clearly shows you and tells you about his love of these historic objects and these folk objects and the baskets and the quilts and the rugs, and he has definite areas of concentration, but it's also pretty broad. Like, he's looking at a lot of different things, and so I think Sheeler and showing both sides, I think it starts to open up another axial possibility for the show, which is that even within the categories that we think are known, there are also surprises and other hinges out. And then there's the way that when you come all the way around to the end of the show, and at the others, the last photographs in the show are Greer Langton. And so Greer is someone who's like making things with her hands. She's drawing, does these incredible notebooks and watercolors that depict a lot. There's a lot about her surgery, and there's a lot of writing, and then she makes these sort of amazing dolls, figures, mannequins, but she also gets into photography. And as far as I know, David Wojnarowicz taught her how to print, and David was living in Peter Hujar's old loft because Peter died of AIDS, and David used to use Peter's darkroom when Peter was alive, but he took over the loft when Peter died, and I think essentially, helped Greer learn how to print. And I love Greer Langton's work. I've been a fan since I was, I first saw a show when I was in my 20s. But when I saw the photographs, I kind of it sort of bumped her up in my estimation a whole other level, because there's this way that she's making the object and then she's photographing, and it adds this whole other set of questions about glamour and beauty and representations of the self, and the way that a photograph can glamorize, and the whole sort of there are all the uses of photography we talked about before, the kind of utilitarian, vernacular, popular. And then there's this other kind of extraordinary history in photography, which is about the self-portrait and the portrayal of the creation of identity through self-portraiture. And I think self-portraiture can be extended to cover photographs of oneself, but also photographs of one's circle and one's immediate surroundings. And it's a way of kind of creating a social identity, not just a self-contained identity, but like what you want to show of yourself to the world. And so like Cindy Sherman's move, Lorna Simpson's move, and then Greer's. She's kind of working across all of these different ways of thinking and making, and something about seeing, and these photographs, they're really beautiful, and sometimes they're spooky and sometimes they're seductive, but when you sort of see them along with the icons like Jackie, or there's a whole kind of construction of how we construct an appearance in the world, and the enormous significance. Like, you can write it off and say, oh, it doesn't matter how you look or whatever, but this is like a really, this runs through our culture at a really profound level. So yeah. I hope that answered some question that was asked in there somewhere.
I don't know how we're doing for time. You brought up the question of class earlier, and when in an interview, great interview early on in your career with Anna Bloom, you're discussing the Faye Richards archive, and she talks about this work as, quote, an intervention against silencing. Wonderful way of describing it. It seems to me that could be said of a great many of the works in your practice, which address questions, processes of erasure in relation to gender, in relation to race and ethnicity. What doesn't come up so much in the writing, and I think it doesn't come up very much in the writing of American art history, or at all, almost at all, in the writing around the work by self-taught artists in the broadest sense, is questions of class.
Right.
And you obviously think very deeply about it. Can you say something about both where you see it as being a galvanizing force in your practice, and how you see it more broadly here in this show?
Yeah. Wow. I just saw Florida Project last week, and Tangerine right before that. And I'm not going to go off on all of that, but I just wanted to mark that because I think it's those two films are thinking about class in a different way, and it's so refreshing. Yeah, I think, maybe it rests as an identity a little bit differently because you can sometimes pass. It's maybe easier to pass on class than on some of the other identities. So it's, and I also think it's like in some ways politically in this country, like one of the hardest things to talk about, because it keeps all the other ones running. It's like the economic interests that sort of maintain the status quo. I was a poor kid, but I loved museums and art, and I felt really comfortable around art and literature, and I read books, and I didn't really understand that they weren't, like, they felt like they were for me. Even though there is a kind of a problem, I think, in how a lot of art is presented or registered in this way that it's that monetary value sometimes gets confused with cultural value or social value or the value of beauty or meaning or experience. And so that kind of confusion or I think is often read that, one hears the contemporary art is elitist, or that it only speaks to a certain class, or that it's exclusionary. I think there are enormous issues that we could talk about for a really long time about institutional exclusion. I think that are still at play, that are not only in the past. You've been using this quote a lot in the last couple of days, The past is never past. And where does that come from again, Lynn? From Faulkner, the past is never past. So I think maybe what happens in my practice, not necessarily intentionally, like I don't like wake up in the morning like, I want to make some work about class. Like that doesn't happen. It's just what happens out of my making because it's how I think about the world and how I feel about the world and how the world's inflected for me, what I notice in the world. And I think the Faye Richards is a really specific work in that it's really what Huey Copeland beautifully called a fabulation. It's imagining into a space that has not been filled yet. So you're imagining what might have been. And the piece attempts to be historically accurate as much as possible. The space that is imagined is actually a possible space. She could have lived. Her story is composed, and many of those images are composed from bits and pieces of many different lives from Dorothy Arzner to Butterfly McQueen to Billie Holiday. There's these things could have happened. So that was a very specific kind of gesture that I don't know I would have made if Cheryl hadn't approached me and asked me to make that work. But in my practice more generally, I think it's often about just noticing things that are already there. And that are not hadn't been considered, that don't fall into conventional definitions of beauty, but that they've been there all along. It's not like, oh my God, all of a sudden, wow, bubblegum on the street. There's been bubblegum on the street. But it's like noticing that and being like, yeah, what neighborhoods does that happen in? What does that mean? Like, what are these signs of life? These pink discs on the sidewalk. And I think, if I could sort of parallel into the show, some of what this show does, and I think what is so inspiring, is it's not a reconstruction or, as Josiah was saying last night, we were talking about the word revisionist, and that it's not a revisionism. It's just actually acknowledging what's been there all along. It's been there all along. And it's just saying, let's stop showing this over there and this over there that are this 1942, 1942. What does it do when you show them together? So that's something that both conceptually and artistically I identify with, and I find deeply inspiring because it also reflects, I think, the way that I work and that many artists work. We're not looking categorically like, I'm only looking at murmur. You're like watching television. And that inflects your work as much as,
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.